In less than 6 minutes, a fast Russian assault unit was almost completely wiped out in open ground before it could even reach the Ukrainian trench line. More than 15 troops on motorcycles, moving at speeds above 120 kilometers per hour and supported by electronic warfare and air defense, disappeared under a wave of low-cost drones. This was not a slow collapse. It was sudden, precise, and finished before the unit could react. What makes this event more serious is not only the level of loss, but how quickly it happened. A force designed for speed and breakthrough was stopped in the most exposed part of the battlefield, where survival depended on moving faster than the enemy could respond. That assumption is now under pressure. Across multiple sectors, movement itself is becoming the moment of greatest risk. Units are no longer safe just because they move fast or strike early. They are being detected, tracked, and targeted long before contact begins. This creates a new kind of battlefield, where the space between two lines is no longer empty. It is watched, measured, and ready to turn into a trap within minutes. Stay with us, because what happened on that narrow dirt road may reveal a deeper shift in modern warfare, where cheap systems can neutralize expensive ones, and speed may no longer guarantee survival. So what really happened before the first explosion? And why did a plan built on speed collapse so completely? The assault was planned as a fast breakthrough, built on the idea that speed could outrun detection and close the distance before a response could form. A Russian unit moved out using motorcycles as the spearhead, aiming to cross a wide strip of exposed ground and reach the Ukrainian trench line in minutes. The plan was simple and direct. Cross the danger zone quickly, dismount at the edge of the defense, and create pressure before the defenders could react in time. This approach relied on timing more than protection. Heavy vehicles had already shown limits in this kind of terrain, where broken ground and constant observation slowed movement and increased risk. Motorcycles offered a different solution. They were lighter, faster, and able to pass through narrow paths that armored platforms could not use effectively. The formation reflected that logic from the start. Riders pushed forward at high speed, keeping a forward line that could cut across the open space without stopping. Behind them, a vehicle carrying electronic warfare equipment moved within the group, meant to interfere with incoming drone signals. Further back, a short-range air defense system followed, ready to respond to aerial threats if they appeared. On paper, this structure created a layered push: speed in front, protection in the middle, and coverage from behind. Each part had a role, and together they were meant to give the unit just enough time to reach its objective. But the critical moment did not come at the trench line. It came earlier, before the unit even entered the most dangerous part of the route. As the formation prepared to move into open ground, Ukrainian reconnaissance drones were already in the air, watching the wider area from a distance. These systems were not searching blindly. They were scanning for movement patterns, heat signatures, and changes in the terrain that suggested organized activity. What appeared on their sensors was not a random shift. It was a group forming, aligning, and then accelerating out of cover. That was enough to trigger attention. At that stage, there was no immediate strike. The drones held position and continued to observe. The goal was not to attack early, but to understand the direction, speed, and shape of the movement. Every second added more detail. The number of riders, the spacing between them, and the presence of supporting vehicles became clearer as the unit pushed forward. Once the formation left the tree line and entered the exposed corridor, the situation changed completely. The background contrast made the moving targets stand out more sharply. Heat from engines and bodies became easier to track against the cooler ground. The entire unit was now visible as a coordinated force moving through a fixed path. From that moment, the assault was no longer hidden. It was being followed in real time. The motorcycles continued to accelerate, and the plan still depended on speed to close the gap. But above them, the conditions had already shifted. The unit had been identified, its path predicted, and its structure understood before the first attack even began. That created a new problem that the riders could not see. They were no longer racing toward a defensive line. They were moving inside a space where every action was being tracked, measured, and prepared for. The question was no longer how fast they could move. The question was whether speed alone could carry them through a battlefield where nothing stayed unseen for long. The turning point came the moment the unit left cover and entered open ground, where speed no longer hid movement but exposed it. As the motorcycles pushed out of the tree line, the visual contrast changed immediately. Heat from engines and riders stood out against the cooler terrain, and the line of movement became clear from above. What had been a fast and controlled advance now appeared as a defined path cutting across a fixed corridor. Ukrainian drones did not need to search anymore. They began continuous tracking, holding the formation in view as it moved deeper into the open space. The unit was no longer just detected. It was now locked in observation, with every shift in speed and direction being followed in real time. The terrain added another layer to this exposure. The path across the fields was narrow, shaped by previous vehicle tracks and damaged ground. It forced the riders into a single channel, only a few meters wide, where movement options were limited. There was no room to spread out or change formation without losing speed. That constraint began to matter more as the unit accelerated. At high velocity, even small adjustments became difficult. Each rider had to maintain position while avoiding uneven ground, and that required steady control. The faster they moved, the less time they had to react to any disruption ahead. Spacing between motorcycles became a critical weakness. The distance was enough for forward motion, but not enough for sudden stops or sharp turns. If one rider slowed or lost balance, those behind would have little chance to avoid a collision. The formation depended on flow, and once that flow was disturbed, recovery would be difficult. From above, this structure was easy to read. The line of riders, the consistent spacing, and the fixed direction created a predictable pattern. The entire unit moved as one shape, and that made it easier to track than a dispersed force. What looked aggressive on the ground appeared organized and exposed from the air. The corridor itself turned into a controlled space. Every meter the motorcycles covered placed them deeper inside an area where movement was no longer private. The drones maintained distance and did not rush the engagement. They followed, adjusted, and waited for the moment when the formation would reach its most vulnerable state. Inside the unit, nothing had visibly changed. Engines were still pushing forward, and the objective remained ahead. The riders focused on speed, believing that reaching the trench line quickly would still give them a chance to break through. But the conditions around them had already shifted. The assault was no longer defined by how fast it could advance. It was now defined by how clearly it could be seen. At that stage, the motorcycles were not breaking through a defensive gap. They were moving along a path that had already been mapped from above. Their direction was known, their formation was understood, and their timing was being measured second by second. This is where speed began to turn into a risk rather than an advantage. The faster the unit moved, the more tightly it held its structure, and the harder it became to adapt. The corridor limited options, and the pace reduced reaction time. The result was a force that looked dynamic from the ground but appeared predictable from the air. That raises a critical question for any modern assault. When every movement can be tracked in real time, does speed still provide an advantage, or does it simply make a unit easier to follow and easier to target? The first strike did not come as a sudden reaction, but as a planned move designed to break the one layer that still protected the advancing unit. While the motorcycles continued forward inside the exposed corridor, Ukrainian FPV teams had already launched from positions several kilometers behind the line. These drones did not rush straight toward the target. They approached in a controlled pattern, adjusting altitude and direction to stay outside early detection. Some flew low, following the shape of the ground and using terrain to remain hidden as long as possible. Others climbed higher, holding a wider view of the battlefield and tracking the full formation from above. This created a layered presence in the air, where each drone had a clear role instead of acting independently. From that position, the structure of the Russian unit became easier to interpret. The line of motorcycles, the spacing, and the supporting vehicles formed a clear picture. one element stood out more than the rest. The vehicle carrying electronic warfare equipment was moving within the group, and its role was critical. That system was not just another part of the formation. It was the only piece capable of disrupting the final seconds of an incoming strike. If it remained active, it could interfere with control signals, distort video feeds, and reduce the accuracy of any drone attempting to close in. Because of that, the decision was made early. The jammer had to be removed first. The drones began to adjust their positions around that objective. Some stayed back to keep the entire formation under observation. Others moved into angles that would allow a direct approach once the moment came. Timing became the most important factor. As the distance closed, interference began to build. Signals on the drone feeds started to weaken and flicker, showing that the electronic warfare system was active and pushing back. The picture was still visible, but it was no longer stable. That created a narrow window. Waiting for a perfect approach would risk losing control entirely. Moving too early could lead to a missed strike. At that point, one drone broke from the pattern and committed ahead of the others. It dropped lower, corrected its path through unstable signals, and aimed directly at the identified target. The approach was fast and direct, leaving little time for adjustment. The impact came within seconds. A sharp explosion cut through the moving formation, and the vehicle carrying the jammer was destroyed before it could relocate or reposition. That single moment changed the entire engagement. The pressure on the remaining drones eased almost immediately. The interference did not disappear completely, but it weakened enough to restore clearer control. Visual feeds stabilized, and operators regained the ability to track movement with greater precision. Inside the Russian formation, the effect was less visible at first, but just as important. The layer that had provided electronic protection was gone. From that point forward, the unit was no longer shielded. Every vehicle, every rider, and every movement was fully exposed to systems already positioned above and around them. The drones began to reorganize. Instead of holding distance, they moved closer, adjusting height and direction to prepare for the next phase. The structure in the air tightened, and the space around the formation began to close. What had started as a controlled approach was now shifting into an active engagement. The destruction of the jammer did more than remove a single vehicle. It opened the path for everything that followed. This was the moment when the balance changed. The assault was still moving forward, but the protection that gave it a chance to survive had already been taken away. The collapse began the moment the formation lost its forward flow, as coordinated movement turned into a chain reaction that spread through the entire unit. After the electronic shield was removed, the drones no longer held back. They shifted into active attack positions and approached from multiple directions at once. Some moved ahead of the column, aligning with the road to block forward progress. Others drifted along the sides, matching speed and waiting for clear angles. A third group followed behind, closing the distance from the rear and cutting off any attempt to turn back. This created pressure from every side at the same time. The riders were still moving forward, but the space around them was shrinking. What had been a straight route now felt enclosed, even though the terrain remained open. The first direct strike against the moving line came from above. A drone dropped quickly and hit the lead motorcycle. The impact was immediate and violent. The bike lost control and crashed across the narrow path, blocking the route that the rest of the unit depended on. That single moment triggered everything that followed. At high speed, there was no room to react. The riders behind could not slow down in time or move around the wreck. One after another, motorcycles collided, swerved, or lost balance while trying to avoid the obstacle. The tight spacing that had allowed them to move fast now worked against them. The formation broke apart in seconds. Instead of a clean line, the unit stretched unevenly along the corridor. Some vehicles were forced to stop, others veered off the path, and a few continued forward without control. The structure that had held the group together no longer existed. That loss of shape made the next phase easier for the drones. Attacks began to land across different points at nearly the same time. A strike from the flank hit a rider trying to move off the road into softer ground, where the motorcycle slowed and became an easy target. Another drone approached from behind and hit a vehicle that had lost pace, turning it into a stationary object in the middle of the path. Each explosion added more disruption. Debris spread across the route, forcing additional riders to change direction or lose balance. Engines were still running, but movement was no longer controlled. As the situation worsened, some soldiers abandoned their motorcycles and tried to escape on foot. They moved toward tree lines and low vegetation, hoping to break visual contact and find cover. But the drones above continued to track them. Movement through open terrain remained visible, and attempts to reach concealment often ended before the soldiers could get far enough. At that stage, the engagement no longer resembled a coordinated assault. It had turned into a series of isolated moments where individuals or small groups tried to survive under constant pressure from above. The drones adapted to that change quickly. Instead of focusing on a single formation, they shifted to multiple small targets. Each movement on the ground was followed, and each pause created a new opportunity for attack. Within minutes, the unit that had entered the corridor as a fast and organized force was no longer operating as a single entity. It had been divided into scattered elements, each exposed and vulnerable on its own. The speed that once defined the assault had disappeared. In its place was confusion, broken movement, and a battlefield controlled from the air. A coordinated assault had become a collection of targets, and the drones were already moving from one to the next. The failure did not stop with the collapse of the assault unit, as the situation quickly expanded into a wider breakdown that affected forces behind the front line. While the scattered riders were still under pressure, the air defense system that had followed the formation struggled to respond in time. The targets it faced were small, fast, and flying close to the ground. Signals appeared briefly and then disappeared into the background, making it difficult to establish a clear lock. Operators attempted to track movement, but the window for action was too short. By the time a target could be identified, it had already shifted position or moved out of range. The system was designed to deal with larger threats, and in this situation, it was reacting to something very different. As a result, no effective counter came from the rear. The drones continued to operate above the area without facing meaningful resistance, and that allowed them to maintain control over the entire engagement zone. At the same time, events behind the initial assault began to unfold. Reports of the disruption reached units positioned further back, and a decision was made to send support forward. A small group of armored vehicles and transport elements started moving toward the damaged corridor, with the aim of recovering survivors and stabilizing the situation. Ukrainian reconnaissance drones, already observing the wider battlefield, detected the new activity as it developed. The direction, speed, and composition of the approaching group became visible before it could reach the front of the engagement. Instead of waiting for the reinforcement to arrive, additional FPV drones were launched to intercept it along the route. The approach was similar in structure, but the targets were now heavier and moving in a more cautious formation. The first strike came as the lead vehicle attempted to enter the same corridor that had already been compromised. A drone moved in and hit near the front, forcing the vehicle to stop at an angle that blocked part of the path. That single hit slowed the entire group behind it. Movement became uneven, and the formation lost its forward rhythm. Another drone followed, targeting a vehicle that tried to maneuver around the obstruction. The impact forced a second halt, and now the route ahead was no longer clear. As pressure increased, the remaining vehicles hesitated. Some held position, while others attempted to reverse or shift direction. The advance that had begun as a rescue effort was now facing the same conditions that had destroyed the original assault. The difference was timing. This time, the interception happened before the group could fully deploy or reach the most dangerous area. From above, the pattern was clear. Any movement toward the disrupted zone was being detected early and engaged before it could become effective. The corridor had turned into a controlled space where entry itself carried immediate risk. Back at the initial site, the remains of the first unit were no longer moving in any organized way. Fires burned along the route, and damaged vehicles marked the path where the formation had collapsed. What began as a fast push toward a defensive line had expanded into a wider failure that affected multiple layers of the operation. The initial plan, the supporting elements, and the follow-up response all encountered the same problem. In the end, the engagement was no longer about one failed attack. It became a clear sequence where each attempt to recover or continue the mission was disrupted before it could succeed. The battlefield did not reset after the first collapse. It remained active, controlled, and ready to deny any second attempt. In just a few minutes, a fast-moving assault that was built on speed, timing, and coordination was reduced to scattered wreckage across a narrow dirt road. What makes this moment so important is not only the loss, but the pattern behind it. A unit was detected early, tracked continuously, and engaged before it could even reach its objective. Every step of the movement was seen, measured, and turned into a target. This points to a deeper shift on today's battlefield. In the past, speed could help a force cross dangerous ground before the enemy could react. Now, danger begins much earlier. It begins at the moment movement is exposed. At the same time, low-cost drone systems are closing the gap between detection and strike. What used to take minutes or longer can now happen almost instantly. That leaves very little space for recovery or adjustment once a unit is seen. This raises a larger question about what comes next. If fast units cannot survive open ground, and heavier forces face the same risks, then how will future assaults be carried out? Will concealment matter more than speed? Or will new tactics emerge to break this cycle of detection and destruction? Share thoughts in the comments and let others know what may come next. If this analysis was useful, like, share, and subscribe to Military Force for more updates on how modern warfare is changing in real time.